Welcome to this deep dive, where we're going to be exploring lessons 71 and 72 from the course, and we're also going to be tackling a couple of thought-provoking listener questions that connect with these teachings. So let's begin with lesson 71.
Okay.
It reads, "Only God's plan for salvation will work. It is senseless for me to search wildly about for salvation. I have seen it in many people and in many things, but when I reached for it, it was not there. I was mistaken about where it is. I was mistaken about what it is. I will undertake no more idle seeking. Only God's plan for salvation will work. And I will rejoice because his plan can never fail." So what are your initial thoughts on this lesson?
Well, this lesson really speaks directly to that common human experience of searching for fulfillment in, external things, relationships, possessions, achievements. It's like thinking, if I just get that promotion or find the perfect partner, then I'll finally be happy. But the Course suggests that this kind of seeking is always going to lead to disappointment because true happiness isn't found in those external things themselves, but in something much deeper.
You're right about that. I think we've all fallen into that trap at some point.
Absolutely. The lesson is reminding us that we often mistake where salvation truly lies. We look for it in the world outside ourselves in fleeting forms of pleasure or validation. But the Course points us inward, suggesting that lasting peace comes from aligning ourselves with God's plan, a plan rooted in forgiveness and recognizing the limitations of our ego's perspective.
So this brings us to our first listener question, which directly asks, in A Course in Miracles, how is God defined? Is God divine?
Okay, great question. Let's dive into that.
Yeah.
So the Course offers a unique perspective on God, highlighting several key points. Firstly, God is defined as pure love, devoid of any negative attributes like anger, judgment, or punishment. This challenges some traditional views of a wrathful deity and presents a God who is entirely loving and benevolent.
That shift in perspective can be quite profound for many people.
Indeed. Secondly, God is described as the ultimate reality, the source of all being. This contrasts with the illusory nature of the physical world, which the Course suggests is a projection of our minds. The true reality lies in the realm of mind, and God is that mind, the source of all thought and creation.
So if the physical world is an illusion, as the Course suggests, what does that mean for our everyday experiences?
Well, it invites us to question our perceptions and recognize that the world we see is filtered through our own thoughts and beliefs. It encourages us to look beyond the surface level of appearances and connect with the deeper reality of God's loving presence within us.
This leads us to the concept of the sonship. How does that fit into the Course's definition of God?
So the sonship represents the unified expression of God's creation. All beings are part of this sonship, highlighting our interconnectedness and shared divine heritage. This emphasizes that we are not separate individuals, but rather expressions of the same loving source.
So it's not about seeking God somewhere out there, but recognizing that divine spark within ourselves and within everyone we encounter.
Exactly. The Course offers a vision of God that emphasizes love, unity, and transcendence of the ego's limited perspective. It's not about a distant judgmental figure, but rather a loving presence that we are all a part of.
Beautiful. Now let's move on to lesson 72, which tackles a significant obstacle to experiencing this love and unity. Our grievances, it states, holding grievances is an attack on God's plan for salvation. Holding grievances is an attempt to prove that God's plan for salvation will not work, yet only his plan will work. By holding grievances, I am therefore excluding my only hope of salvation from my awareness. I would no longer defeat my own best interests in this insane way. I would accept God's plan for salvation and be happy. So how do you see this lesson connecting with the ideas we've been discussing?
Well, this lesson highlights how clinging to grievances actively works against our own happiness and prevents us from aligning with God's plan for salvation. It's a powerful statement that really challenges us to examine how we might be holding ourselves back.
Well, why is it so hard to let go of grievances?
Yeah.
What does the ego gain from clinging to those hurts and resentments?
That's a crucial question. Remember, the Course tells us that the ego thrives on separation.
Right.
It wants to maintain the illusion that we are separate individuals, each fighting for our own survival, and grievances reinforce that illusion. They give us a sense of righteousness of being the victim, which the ego uses to justify its fear-based perspective.
It's like we get caught in a loop of blaming others for our unhappiness instead of taking responsibility for our own thoughts and feelings.
You got it. The ego wants to convince us that our suffering is caused by external factors, by what others have done or haven't done to us. But the Course suggests that true freedom comes from recognizing that our thoughts are the real source of our experience.
Okay, so how can we recognize when we're letting grievances cloud our judgment? And what practical steps can we take to release them?
So, one way to recognize a grievance's grip is to pay attention to your emotions.
Okay.
Are you feeling stuck in anger or a sense of injustice? Are you replaying past hurts, blaming others, or feeling like you're owed something? These are all signs that a grievance might be clouding your perception.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's about becoming more aware of our own thought patterns and how they're contributing to our experience.
Absolutely. And once you recognize that you're holding on to a grievance, you can start to shift your perspective. Instead of focusing on the perceived wrong that has been done to you, try to see the situation through the lens of forgiveness and compassion.
This ties in perfectly with our second listener question, which asks, since A Course in Miracles says the ego holds grievances and causes separation, is the ego an internal version of Christianity's devil or Satan?
That's a common question. And it highlights some interesting parallels between the Course's concept of the ego and traditional notions of evil.
Okay.
Both the ego and the traditional concept of Satan or the devil promote fear, guilt, separation, and opposition to the divine. They both tempt us to choose darkness over light.
So while they might not be the same entity, they seem to serve similar functions in leading us away from our true nature.
Exactly. However, it's important to note that the Course views the ego as an illusory thought system, a miscreation of our minds, rather than a separate independent being like the traditional Satan.
So it's not about battling an external force, but correcting an error in thinking.
Right. The focus is on recognizing the ego's voice within us and choosing a different path, a path of love, forgiveness, and unity.
This brings us back to the idea of God's plan for salvation being about choosing love over fear, recognizing the ego's illusions and aligning with the truth of our interconnectedness.
Precisely. And while the term Satan isn't directly used in the Course, some interpreters use the devil, or Satan, metaphorically, to describe the ego's destructive influence. It helps emphasize the power the ego has to lead us astray from our true nature.
So while there are similarities between the ego and traditional concepts of Satan, the emphasis in the Course is on correcting the ego's error through a shift in perception.
Absolutely. We shift from a fear-based, ego-driven perspective to one rooted in love, forgiveness, and the recognition of our inherent unity with God and with each other.
That's a profound insight, and it offers a lot to reflect on.
Now that we've sort of unpacked the concepts behind lessons 71 and 72, let's explore the practical application by looking at the practice instructions.
Okay, so lesson 71 guides us with this. God's plan for salvation will save me in this. This is no exception in God's plan for my salvation. Let me perceive this only in the light of God's plan for salvation. This feels like a call to view every situation, even the difficult ones, through a lens of trust in a higher purpose.
Right. It's encouraging a shift from fear and lack to faith in a power beyond our limited understanding. Rather than getting caught up in the problem, we can step back and ask, how might this be part of a bigger plan for my ultimate good?
Yeah, it's a powerful reframing. It suggests that even amidst challenges, there's a greater purpose unfolding, a purpose that leads us toward our own well-being.
The Course emphasizes that God's plan for salvation is always in operation, whether we're aware of it or not. By choosing to see things through this lens, we align ourselves with that plan and open ourselves to its transformative power.
Let go and let God, surrendering our need to control and allowing a higher power to guide us.
Yes, it involves cultivating trust that even when things seem difficult or unfair, there's a greater good unfolding.
So instead of resisting or struggling against challenges, we can view them as opportunities for growth and learning opportunities to surrender to a wisdom beyond our own.
We move from a place of fear and resistance to a place of acceptance and surrender, recognizing that we're not alone and that a loving force is supporting us every step of the way.
Now let's move on to the practice exercise for lesson 72, which says, I am choosing between misperception and salvation as I look on this. If I see grounds for grievances in this way, I will not see the grounds for my salvation. This calls for salvation, not attack. This seems to be urging us to make a conscious choice between holding on to grievances and choosing a path of healing.
Right. It highlights that we always have a choice in how we perceive any given situation. We can see it through the lens of the ego, focusing on separation, blame, and attack, or we can choose the lens of the Holy Spirit, which emphasizes forgiveness, unity, and love.
Yeah, we often react habitually, letting old patterns of thinking dictate our responses. But this lesson reminds us that we have the power to choose a different path, to choose healing, instead of perpetuating the cycle of pain.
The exercise is reminding us that holding on to grievances blinds us to the possibility of salvation. It traps us in a cycle of suffering and prevents us from experiencing the peace and joy that come with forgiveness.
So how do we actually make that choice in practical terms? How do we shift from attack to salvation?
Well, the Course suggests that the key lies in recognizing that our perception is always a choice. We can focus on the perceived wrongs that have been done to us, or we can choose to focus on the possibility of healing and reconciliation.
It sounds like it requires a willingness to question our own judgments and be open to seeing things from a different perspective, taking responsibility for our own happiness rather than blaming others.
Stepping back from the ego's need to be right and asking ourselves, is there another way to see this situation? Is there a way to see this person with more compassion and understanding?
This ties back to the idea from Lesson 71 of seeing everything in the light of God's plan for salvation. If we truly believe that there's a higher purpose at work, even in the midst of challenges, it becomes easier to let go of grievances and embrace forgiveness.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Okay, so let's take a moment to kind of recap the key insights we've explored from these lessons in the listener questions.
Yeah, so we began by exploring the idea that true salvation lies in aligning ourselves with God's plan, a plan that's rooted in forgiveness and recognizing the limitations of the ego's perspective.
Right.
And we talked about how we often make the mistake of seeking happiness in external things, but the Course reminds us that lasting fulfillment comes from an inner shift in perception.
And the listener question about how God is defined in the Course really led to a beautiful understanding of God as pure love, the ultimate reality and the source of all being. It's a perspective that challenges some traditional views and offers a much more expansive and inclusive understanding of the divine.
Yeah, and then we kind of delved into this concept of grievances, right? Recognizing how they can block our experience of true happiness and keep us trapped in that cycle of suffering.
Right.
The ego thrives on separation, and grievances reinforce that illusion, convincing us that our pain is caused by those external factors.
And the second listener question really explored the similarities between the ego and traditional notions of evil, such as the devil or Satan. And while the Course doesn't explicitly equate them, it does acknowledge the similar roles they play in tempting us away from love and towards fear, separation, and attack.
Right. But the Course emphasizes that the ego is ultimately an illusion, a miscreation of our own minds.
Yeah.
Therefore, the path to salvation lies not in battling some external force, but in correcting this error, in thinking by choosing love over fear and recognizing our inherent unity with God and with each other.
Yes, so the practice instructions for lessons 71 and 72 provide that practical guidance on how to apply these concepts in our daily lives. We learn to view every situation through the lens of God's plan for salvation, trusting that even in the midst of challenges, there's a greater purpose at play.
And we are also reminded that we always have a choice in how we perceive things.
Right.
We can choose to see the world through the ego's eyes, focusing on grievances and attack, or we can choose that path of salvation, embracing forgiveness and unity.
So if we truly accept that only God's plan for salvation works, how might our lives look different? What changes would we need to make?
It really invites us to examine our own thoughts, beliefs, and actions and ask ourselves, am I aligned with the ego's agenda or with God's plan for my salvation? The insights that we've gained from these lessons in the listener questions are just the beginning. The Course offers a very profound path of spiritual awakening, and we encourage you to continue exploring its teachings and discover the transformative power that they hold.
Beautiful. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the Course. We look forward to exploring more of its wisdom with you in our next episode.